A retired soldier lifting deadwood into his pickup stops cold when a tiny puppy blocks his path, eyes burning with urgency in the winter snow. He tries to walk away, but the puppy refuses, tugging at his pants like it knows something terrible has already happened. One choice pulls him off the road and into the forest, where faith, fear, and destiny collide in the cold. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and the miracles God hides in the darkest places. Winter clamped down on the outskirts of Spokane, snow whispering through bare trees as a lone pickup idled by a logging road, breath turning white in the air. Michael Carter balanced the weight of a dead log against his shoulder and told himself not to rush. Rushing led to mistakes. Mistakes led to pain, physical, sometimes worse. The wood was cold and stubborn, its bark flaking into his gloves as he trudged toward the open bed of the pickup. He had learned over years he preferred not to revisit that there was a correct way to carry weight. Let it settle, let your bones agree to it, and move. The log thudded into place. Michael straightened, joints protesting, and scanned the tree line out of habit more than caution. The forest was quiet in that way, winter perfected, not silent, but holding its breath. He reached for another length of deadwood and felt the familiar tug in his shoulder. 45 was an age that spoke back. It reminded him that strength wasn't endless, that endurance came with a price. He lifted again. That was when he noticed the dog. It stood near the rear tire, small and still, as if it had stepped out of the snow rather than the trees. It didn't bark. It didn't run. It watched. There was something unnerving about that watchfulness. Steady, unblinking, not hungry in the way strays often were, not pleading either. Michael shifted the log and felt a faint old tension tighten behind his ribs. "Not today," he muttered, to no one in particular. He set the wood down and turned back to the pile, telling himself the animal would wander off. That was what animals did. They assessed risk, then chose the path that kept them breathing. He respected that instinct. It had saved him more than once. The log scraped against the metal bed. Michael wiped his gloves on his jeans and reached for another. He was halfway through lifting when he felt it, something light, insistent, at his leg. Teeth. Not biting. Catching. Michael froze. The dog had clamped gently onto the fabric of his pants, tugging once, twice, not aggressive, but urgent. It was the kind of contact that made your body react before your mind did. His muscles tensed, breath hitching, old reflexes flaring. For a split second, he was somewhere else, sand underfoot, noise without shape. Then the moment passed. "Hey," he said quietly. The dog released him and stepped back. It didn't retreat far. It didn't lower itself into submission. It simply waited, eyes fixed on his, as if the next move belonged to him. Michael straightened slowly. He could feel his heart beating harder than it should have for such a small thing. That annoyed him. He had learned to live with annoyance. It was easier than fear. "You shouldn't do that," he told the dog, his voice even. "That's how you get hurt." The dog's ears flicked. Snow dusted its nose. It didn't look away. Michael glanced at the road, then at the woods. No houses close, no footprints he could see. The forest swallowed people and stories all the time. It had a talent for it. He considered the clock, the work waiting, the paycheck that arrived only if he finished the load. He turned back to the wood. Behind him, the dog made a sound, not a bark, not a whine, something thinner. It slid between breaths and lodged there. Michael paused with the log halfway lifted, shoulders burning. He shut his eyes for a moment, long enough to be annoyed at himself for doing so. "I can't," he said, as if the dog might understand. "I can't do this." The word "this" carried more weight than the log. It always did. He hoisted the wood and dropped it into the truck bed harder than necessary. The sound echoed, sharp in the cold. When he turned, the dog was closer. Too close. Close enough that Michael could see the tremor in its stance, Not fear exactly, but effort. Holding on took work. The dog tugged at his pant leg again, firmer this time, then released and took a few steps toward the tree line. It stopped and looked back. Waited. Michael laughed once, short and humorless. "You've got the wrong guy," he said. "I don't follow." He had learned that lesson early. Following got people killed. Following meant giving your center of gravity to someone else and trusting they wouldn't pull when you couldn't brace. He had buried friends who trusted. The dog took another step into the snow, then another, then turned again. Its patience was not endless, but it was deep. It did not beg. It invited. Michael felt the familiar pressure behind his eyes. He pressed his tongue to the roof of his mouth and counted his breaths. The forest breathed back. He saw himself as he was now, a man with a pickup full of deadwood, a body that remembered too much, a life pared down to things that didn't ask questions. He could leave. The thought was clean and simple. He could finish the load, drive back to town, hand over the keys, collect the hours. He could tell himself, as he had so many times, that there were limits to responsibility, that compassion needed borders, or it would drown you. The dog made the sound again, thinner this time, closer. Michael looked down at his pants where the fabric was scuffed by teeth marks. He thought of how many uniforms he had worn through, how many seams had split under strain. He thought of weight, how some of it settled into muscle, and some of it lodged in places that never healed. "All right," he said finally, not loudly. "All right." The dog didn't celebrate. It didn't rush him. It simply turned and walked toward the trees, slow enough for him to follow. Michael took one step, then stopped, anger flaring hot and sudden, anger at the dog, at himself, at the part of him that had already decided. "This doesn't mean anything," he said to the air. "You hear me? I'm just checking." He locked the tailgate. The click sounded final. He shoved his hands into his pockets and followed the dog into the snow. The forest accepted them without comment. Branches arched overhead like ribs. Michael's boots crunched softly as he walked. The dog stayed just ahead, pausing every few steps to make sure he was there, not leading so much as pacing him. Michael felt the old awareness sharpen, distance, sound, the shape of ground beneath snow. He hated how easily it returned. He hated how part of him missed it. He had built a life around not needing to notice every shadow. They moved deeper. The air grew stiller. Michael's breath slowed, not with calm, but with focus. He told himself this was nothing, a stray, a coincidence. The mind reached for explanations the way hands reached for rails. Then he saw it, a small shape half buried where the snow thinned near a fallen branch. He crouched. The dog hovered close, vibrating with something Michael didn't have a word for. He brushed away the snow and uncovered a battered teddy bear. One eye hung loose. The fabric was dark with age and damp. It was the kind of thing that had been held tight enough to wear thin. Michael closed his eyes. He didn't need a story to know this didn't belong here. Forests didn't grow toys. They kept what was left. The dog pressed closer, a quiet insistence at his side. Michael swallowed and stood, the bear heavy in his gloved hand despite its size. He felt the pull of the truck behind him, the pull of the road, the pull of the life he had narrowed to survive. He looked at the dog. "Okay," he said, and this time the word landed. "Show me." The dog turned and moved on. Michael followed, carrying the weight he had chosen. Snow thickened beneath the trees, muffling sound and distance as the forest closed around Michael Carter and the dog, the logging road already dissolving behind them. Michael Carter followed at a measured pace, not because the dog set it, but because Michael Carter needed the rhythm to steady himself, one step, then another, boots pressing certainty into ground that refused it. The dog moved ahead with a restraint that felt deliberate, stopping often, glancing back, not urging but confirming, as if aware that trust was a fragile material and could not be pulled too hard without tearing. Michael Carter hated how familiar that felt. He had spent years learning to read movements like this, to recognize when something was not panic but intention, not confusion but memory. The forest pressed close, bare branches arching overhead like ribs, and Michael Carter caught himself scanning angles, counting spaces between trees, cataloging shadows, the old habits rising uninvited. He told himself this was just a walk, just following a stray for a few minutes, nothing more. Yet his body did not believe him. His shoulders stayed tense, his breath shallow, his thoughts circling the same warning he had ignored too many times in another life. You do not go off path unless you are prepared to carry what you find. The dog paused near a low rise where the snow thinned, sniffed the air, then waited, its stillness sharp with expectation. Michael Carter slowed, the battered teddy bear heavy in his pocket now, a weight that did not belong to muscle. He wondered who had held it last, whether it had been clutched in fear or sleep, whether it had been dropped or taken, and the questions tightened something in his chest he had trained himself to keep loose. He had not come here to ask questions. He had come to finish a job, to load wood, to go home to a quiet room where nothing asked him to remember. The dog took a few steps forward and stopped again, a pattern forming, a language without words. Michael Carter felt irritation rise, sharp and defensive, because irritation was easier than admitting the truth creeping up behind it. He was afraid of what this animal knew. He remembered another winter, another place where cold pressed in and choices narrowed, where following had meant walking into a trap disguised as necessity. He had survived that by listening to the wrong voice, the one that told him duty was heavier than doubt. The consequences of that lesson had followed him long after the uniforms were folded away. Now, in this quiet forest, the dog turned its head just enough for Michael Carter to see the insistence there, not frantic, not desperate, but anchored, as if whatever lay ahead had already happened and could not be undone by hesitation. Michael Carter exhaled slowly and forced himself to name what he was feeling. Responsibility. The word tasted like rust. He did not owe this dog anything, he told himself. He did not owe the forest answers. He had done his share, more than his share, and the world had not balanced the scales in return. Yet his feet kept moving. The ground sloped downward, the snow broken by faint disturbances that might have been animal tracks, might have been nothing. And Michael Carter found himself crouching, brushing at the surface with his glove, then stopping, anger flickering at the realization that he was already investigating. He straightened and shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping him before he could stop it. This was how it started, always, not with orders or alarms, but with a feeling you tried to ignore until it wrapped itself around your spine. The dog moved closer now, not touching, just near enough to remind him it was there, and Michael Carter felt the strange pressure of being watched without judgment. He thought of the men he had lost, of the silence that followed their names, of the way memory clung the same way this dog did, refusing to be shaken loose. He told himself again that this was temporary, that he would turn back soon, that the logging road would still be there, the truck still waiting, the life he had chosen still intact. The forest answered with quiet. The dog stopped near a cluster of fallen branches and looked back, its gaze steady, and Michael Carter felt a shift, subtle but unmistakable, the moment when following became choosing. He reached into his pocket and closed his hand around the teddy bear, the fabric cold and damp, and the gesture surprised him with its finality. He was carrying evidence now, whether he wanted to call it that or not. He stepped forward, past the dog, then stopped himself and waited instead, forcing his pace to match the animal's, acknowledging without words that this was not his path to lead. The dog resumed walking, and with each step Michael Carter felt the distance from his truck stretch, not just in yards, but in intent. He wondered how long it had been since he had allowed something outside himself to dictate direction, and the answer unsettled him. The forest grew denser, the light thinner, and Michael Carter felt a familiar calm settle over his nerves, the kind that came not from peace, but from acceptance. Whatever lay ahead would be what it was. He could not unknow the bear in his pocket, could not unsee the patience in the dog's movements. He could only decide how far he was willing to go before turning back. The dog stopped once more, nose lifting, listening to something Michael Carter could not hear, and for a moment the world seemed to pause with them, breath held, waiting for the next step, a step that would take them closer to an answer neither of them was ready to name. The forest dipped toward a shallow ravine where snow gathered unevenly, light thinning as clouds slid lower, turning the winter afternoon into something closer to dusk. Michael Carter felt the change in terrain before he fully saw it, the way the ground softened and sloped, the way the trees seemed to lean inward as if listening, and the sensation stirred an old alertness he had never quite unlearned. The dog slowed, its pace tightening, movements becoming smaller and more deliberate. And Michael Carter recognized the shift immediately. This was not wandering anymore. This was narrowing. He followed without comment, jaw set, the teddy bear pressing against his thigh with every step, a reminder that he had crossed a line he could not step back over simply by deciding to. His thoughts drifted to the idea of thresholds, how some were visible, and some only made sense after you had passed them, and how, in his life, the most consequential ones had rarely announced themselves. The dog stopped near a fallen log, half buried in snow, sniffed the air, then circled once, agitation flickering through its stillness, and Michael Carter felt a prickle of unease trace up his spine. He scanned the area, not for danger in the immediate sense, but for absence, for the wrongness that came when something expected was missing. Kneeling, he brushed aside snow with slow, careful movements, not wanting to disturb more than necessary, and his glove caught on a thin metal chain. He paused, breath tightening, then lifted it free. The object at the end swung gently, a small heart-shaped locket, scratched and dulled, its hinge bent as if it had been forced open. Michael Carter held it between his fingers, the cold biting through his gloves, and for a moment he did not open it, as if delaying the truth might change it. The dog edged closer, not touching him, but present, its attention fixed on the locket with an intensity that made Michael Carter's chest ache. When he finally pressed the heart open, the tiny photograph inside stole the air from his lungs. A little girl smiled back at him, arms wrapped around the dog standing beside him now, their faces pressed close together in a way that spoke of habit and trust, of a bond built through ordinary days. Michael Carter closed the locket quickly, as if shielding the image from the forest, and sat back on his heels, the weight in his chest spreading outward, heavier than any log he had lifted that morning. This was not an accident. This was not a stray animal leading him on a pointless detour. This was memory, preserved in metal and paper, dragged into the snow by violence or desperation, and the realization settled over him with a quiet finality. He had seen this pattern before, not in forests, but in ruined buildings and makeshift camps, where personal objects told stories their owners could not finish. The dog let out a low sound, not a whine, but something closer to recognition, and Michael Carter felt the strange, humbling certainty that the animal understood the gravity of what had been found. He rose slowly, slipping the locket into his pocket beside the teddy bear, feeling the way the two objects balanced each other there, one speaking of comfort, the other of connection. His mind raced now, not with panic but with calculation, threads pulling together into a shape he did not yet want to name. A child. Somewhere ahead, or somewhere behind, or somewhere no one had thought to look. The forest offered no answers, only space, and Michael Carter realized with a dull thud that he was no longer measuring distance in steps back to his truck, but in the widening circle of responsibility around him. He considered turning back, considered the logistics of doing nothing, of convincing himself that this was beyond him, but the thought rang hollow before it fully formed. He had once walked away from a village because the orders had told him to, and the memory of that decision had followed him into every quiet room since. The dog moved again, quicker now, stopping often, looking back, urgency threading through its restraint, and Michael Carter felt the fragile boundary between past and present thin. He followed, senses sharpened, the forest narrowing into corridors of trees and shadow, and he noticed signs he might have missed before. Snow disturbed in ways that did not match animal movement, branches broken at an unnatural height. The faint suggestion of a path that existed only because something had been dragged through it. His stomach tightened. He did not let himself imagine too far ahead, did not let himself picture the girl from the photograph beyond the bare facts of her existence, because hope could be as dangerous as despair if you carried it wrong. The dog stopped at the edge of a deeper hollow and looked back, its gaze steady, unafraid. And Michael Carter felt a quiet understanding pass between them, not of outcome, but of intent. Whatever had happened here mattered, and pretending otherwise would be its own kind of violence. He took one step forward, then another, aware that the forest was no longer just a place of work or refuge, but a witness, holding traces of a story that had not ended yet. And as the light dimmed further and the cold pressed closer, Michael Carter knew that the next thing they found would decide whether this path led toward rescue or reckoning. Night pressed down on the small mountain village, snow swirling through yellow lamplight, as Michael Carter stepped from his truck into a silence broken only by wind and distant doors closing. Michael Carter did not plan what he would say, and that, more than anything, unsettled him, because planning had once been the only thing that kept people alive. He carried the cold with him into the village hall, boots leaving wet prints on worn wood, the weight in his pockets heavier now than when he had lifted dead logs that morning. A handful of villagers looked up as he entered, faces cautious, tired in a way that came from long winters and shorter hopes. And Michael Carter felt the old instinct to keep his distance, to observe without being observed, to pass through without leaving a mark. He had done that all his life. He cleared his throat once and realized his voice felt unused. He did not introduce himself properly, did not explain where he was from or what he did for a living, because none of that seemed to matter in this moment. Instead, he reached into his pocket and set the teddy bear on the table, between them, its worn fabric darkened by snowmelt. The room shifted, a collective inhale he could almost hear. He followed it by placing the heart-shaped locket beside it, not opening it yet, just letting it rest there like a quiet accusation. Michael Carter spoke slowly, choosing plain words, because he had learned that simple truths were harder to dismiss. He told them he worked in the forest, that a dog had followed him, that it had not let him go, and that where it led him, he found these things. He did not dramatize the story, did not raise his voice, but as he spoke he felt something loosen in his chest, as if the act of saying it out loud was finally giving the weight somewhere else to sit. When he opened the locket and turned it so they could see the photograph inside, the room went still. A woman near the back pressed a hand to her mouth. An older man lowered his gaze. Someone whispered a name Michael Carter did not catch. He waited, resisting the urge to fill the silence, knowing that silence was often where truth settled best. A man stepped forward then, his movements stiff, and asked where exactly Michael Carter had found the dog, how far into the forest, how much snow. The questions came faster after that, overlapping, not panicked, but urgent, and Michael Carter answered each one as honestly as he could, careful not to promise what he could not deliver. Someone said the girl's family had once owned land near the ridge, before everything collapsed, before money dried up and friends disappeared. Someone else said there had been trouble years ago, whispers of betrayal, of people who had lost more than they could afford, and blamed the wrong targets. Michael Carter listened, absorbing fragments, feeling the shape of a larger story emerge, one that did not belong to him, but had still found him. He did not ask them to help. That was the part that surprised him most. He had come ready to argue, to persuade, to justify the risk, but the words did not come. Instead, he found himself saying something quieter, something that had been forming since the forest. He said that the dog was still out there, waiting, that it had not given up, and that he did not think it would stop trying, even if no one followed. He admitted without ceremony that he was not law enforcement anymore, not anyone with authority, just a man who had been shown something he could not unsee. He said he would go back into the woods with or without help, not because he was brave, but because leaving felt worse. The room held that admission like a fragile thing. For a moment, Michael Carter feared he had misjudged them, that fatigue and caution would win, that everyone would look away and let winter swallow the rest. Then a woman reached for her coat. A younger man grabbed a flashlight from a hook by the door. Someone else began passing out gloves, scarves, anything warm enough to matter. No one spoke of heroism or obligation. They moved with the quiet coordination of people who understood that some losses echoed through a community, whether you chose to hear them or not. Michael Carter felt a strange, unfamiliar sensation spread through him. Not relief exactly, but alignment, as if something long bent had straightened just a little. Outside, the wind cut sharper, snow stinging his face as they stepped into the night, and he spotted the dog near the edge of the light, waiting, patient as ever. The animal looked from face to face, then back at him, and Michael Carter felt the smallest flicker of something like trust take hold. The villagers divided without instruction, some heading toward the lower ravines, others toward the ridge, their lamps bobbing like distant stars swallowed by trees. Michael Carter stayed where he was for a heartbeat, absorbing the reality of it, the fact that this was no longer his burden alone. He had learned long ago that shared risk did not guarantee shared survival, but it did something else, something harder to measure, and as he turned back toward the forest with the dog at his side, he knew that whatever waited ahead would be faced by more than silence this time. Snow fell harder in the deep forest, night closing ranks as scattered beams of flashlight light cut thin paths through trees and shadow. Michael Carter moved with the group, but not within it, instinct placing him a step behind the dog, close enough to follow, far enough to see what others might miss. The village had dissolved into silence once they entered the trees, voices replaced by breath and the crunch of boots, and Michael Carter felt the familiar narrowing of focus take hold, the one that stripped emotion down to function. He did not fight it. Tonight, it was useful. The dog worked without hesitation, stopping often, doubling back, confirming, its determination unbroken by cold or fatigue. And Michael Carter sensed that this was not searching so much as returning, tracing a memory worn deep by fear and loyalty. He watched how the villagers moved, awkward at first, then steadier, adjusting to the terrain, learning the forest's language one careful step at a time. And he felt a quiet respect for them, for the choice they had made, without guarantees. The beam of his flashlight caught irregular patterns in the snow, disturbances that did not belong to animals, and his stomach tightened as recognition settled in. He signaled once, sharply but without sound, and a man nearby nodded, understanding without explanation. Michael Carter realized then how little he needed to say when the moment demanded clarity instead of comfort. The dog slowed near a stand of trees where the ground dipped, its movements growing tense, its focus sharpening into something like resolve, and Michael Carter felt the shift ripple through him as well. This was the place. He did not know how he knew, only that his body reacted before his thoughts caught up. He crouched, brushing snow aside with gloved hands, and found marks half filled by drifting flakes, the unmistakable sign of something heavy dragged unwillingly. The memory of other nights, other searches pressed in, but he kept it at bay, anchoring himself to the present, to the rhythm of breath and motion. Someone behind him whispered a name, not loudly, but with hope wrapped tight around it, and Michael Carter felt the weight of expectation settle across his shoulders. He did not turn. He followed the dog as it moved again, faster now, urgency threading through its restraint, and the forest seemed to close around them, branches clawing at coats, light thinning to narrow cones. Then the dog stopped abruptly and refused to move forward, circling instead, its agitation unmistakable. Michael Carter stepped past it and felt the world contract to a single point as his light swept across a shape half buried beneath snow and fallen limbs. A small hand, still, pale against the dark. For a heartbeat the forest held its breath, and Michael Carter felt the old familiar dread rise, the one that whispered he was too late again. He dropped to his knees, ignoring the cold seeping through fabric, and reached out with deliberate care, clearing snow, exposing a small arm, then a shoulder, then the fragile outline of a child curled inward as if trying to disappear. He checked for breath without thinking, fingers steady despite the tremor threatening to break through. And when he felt it, faint but present, something in his chest gave way. He did not shout. He did not celebrate. He called out calmly, voice controlled, because panic wasted time, and time was the one thing they did not have. The villagers moved in, hands offering light, coats, warmth, their fear tempered by purpose, and Michael Carter guided them with quiet instructions, grounding each action in necessity. He wrapped his jacket around the child, shielding her from the wind, and held her closer than he had held anyone in years, the weight of her slight body cutting through his practiced distance. The dog pressed close, a constant presence, its focus unwavering, and Michael Carter felt the strange symmetry of it all, how something so small could anchor so many people in the same moment. As they prepared to move, lifting carefully, Michael Carter glanced back at the path they had taken and felt a sobering clarity settle in. Finding her alive did not erase what had been done. It did not restore what had been lost, but it mattered. It mattered in a way that defied balance sheets and outcomes. As they began the slow return toward the village lights, snow thickening around them, Michael Carter felt the weight he carried shift, no lighter, but shared now. And in that shared burden, there was a fragile, stubborn hope that refused to be extinguished by the cold. Dawn crept over the forest and the village beyond, snow paling to blue-gray as the wind eased, and the long night finally loosened its grip. Michael Carter walked beside the others as they carried the child toward the village lights, the weight in his arms replaced by a quieter vigilance as hands steadier than his took over, because saving a life was never a single act, but a sequence of careful decisions that did not end when breath returned. The cold bit less sharply now, or perhaps he felt it less, his body still humming with the aftermath of focus, that familiar state where exhaustion waited politely for permission. The dog stayed close, not frantic, not celebratory, simply present, its attention anchored to the child as if proximity itself were a promise. When they reached the first houses, doors opened without being asked, warmth spilling outward along with murmured relief. And Michael Carter felt a strange humility at the way community moved when it decided to, without ceremony, without command. A village medic, older and practical, took charge with few words, hands practiced by years of quiet crises, and Michael Carter stepped back then, because knowing when to release control was as important as knowing when to take it. He watched the child wrapped in blankets, watched color return in small, stubborn increments, and felt something unclench inside him that he had kept tight for a very long time. The night's fear receded, leaving behind a different ache, one that did not demand action, only acknowledgement. Inside the hall, people spoke softly, passing cups of something hot, sharing fragments of memory that finally had a place to land. And Michael Carter listened from the edge, absorbing the rhythm of ordinary voices after extraordinary strain. He did not insert himself into their relief. He had learned the cost of that, how easy it was to mistake presence for ownership. The dog settled near the child, a silent sentinel, its watchfulness unbroken, And Michael Carter recognized that stance with a pang of recognition, the way duty could become identity if you let it. He remembered how often he had failed to set his own weapon down when the fighting stopped, how that vigilance had followed him home and hollowed the spaces where rest should have lived. A man approached him then, someone from the village who had asked the most questions the night before, and thanked him without flourish, the gratitude plain and unembellished, which made it harder to deflect. Michael Carter nodded and said it was nothing, because he did not yet know how to name what it was. He stepped outside for air, letting the cold clear his head, and stood by his truck, the bed still full of deadwood that felt oddly irrelevant now. He considered the work waiting, the routines that had kept him balanced by keeping him numb, and understood that numbness was no longer an option available to him. When the child stirred and spoke, the sound carried through the open door like a fragile bell, and Michael Carter found himself holding his breath again, but this time for a different reason. The dog responded instantly, alert without alarm, and Michael Carter felt a soft, unexpected gratitude for the animal's steadiness, for the way it modeled a vigilance that did not consume itself. Inside, the medic nodded. The crisis passed into the long work of recovery, and Michael Carter realized that endings were rarely clean, that they bled into mornings that asked for patience rather than courage. He stayed until the light strengthened and the village began to move with purpose instead of fear. Then he gathered his things with an unfamiliar care, as if each small action mattered now in a way it had not before. Before leaving, he knelt once beside the child, not touching, just close enough to be seen. And the child looked at him with eyes still clouded by sleep and shock, but focused enough to hold recognition. The dog shifted, allowing the moment without guarding it, and Michael Carter felt a quiet agreement pass between them, an understanding that protection could include letting go. He returned the teddy bear to the child, placing it within reach, and the simple act settled something he had carried since finding it in the snow. Outside again, he started the truck and let it idle, the engine's rumble grounding him, and for the first time in years, he did not feel the urge to flee the quiet that followed. The village stood behind him, intact in a way it had not been the night before, and the forest ahead no longer felt like a place that swallowed stories, but one that had relinquished one back. Michael Carter drove away slowly, not because he was reluctant to leave, but because he was willing to arrive somewhere else in his own time, carrying with him a new measure for weight and responsibility. He knew he would return to work, that logs would still need lifting and days would still require structure, but he also knew that something essential had shifted, a recalibration born not of orders or survival, but of choosing to follow when turning away would have been easier. As the road curved and the village disappeared from view, the snow began to fall again, gentler this time, and Michael Carter felt a sense of completion settle over him, not triumph, not redemption, but a steadier thing, the knowledge that for once he had stayed, and that staying had been enough. Sometimes miracles don't arrive with thunder or fire from the sky. Sometimes they come quietly, on 4 small paws, through a choice to stop instead of walk away. Perhaps God does not always remove the storm, but places a guide inside it, asking us one simple question: will you follow? In everyday life, we pass moments like this more often than we realize. Someone in need, a voice asking for help, a chance to be present instead of indifferent. If this story touched your heart, let it be a reminder that faith is not only spoken, it is lived through action. Please share this story with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment with your thoughts or prayers, and subscribe to the channel so more stories of light can reach the world. May God bless you, protect your loved ones, and guide your steps today and always.